And we be live.
Hell yeah. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Outpost. We got Alicia Victoria in the chat already. Hope you guys are having a good night. Looks like it might be a little bit small of an audience tonight, but that's okay. We're going to jump right into the material here in just a minute. But we want to welcome you guys back. If you don't know already, this is the Outpost. This is Chris and I's midweek show where we talk about things affecting the West, and we've started a series discussing Arthurian knights, and we're going to move through several of them and Merlin before jumping to something else. The significance and the allegory behind these stories we feel like is very, very important, and basically are moral and ethical anchors to people today and things that we need to return to and understand that you have a patrimony that you belong to and have been estranged from. But before we do that, we want to jump into the website and show you guys the merch as usual. redpillthreads.com/watchfire. What's up, dude? What is up, Skank Hunter 420?
That Appeal to Heaven one is badass, dude.
Yeah, I like it too. There you guys can see the new merch. Let us know in the live chat if you guys have gotten anything. The flock ones I think are pretty cool. I know somebody wrote me and said that they got the one with the actual flock camera on there, not the video game one. And then I know somebody else who picked up one of those Actinon Verbas right there on the end. But yeah, good quality shirts, and Red Pill Threads makes a bunch of different shirts. There's other creators over there that are hosted, and then as well they make their own stuff. I like to say I like my Yuri Bezmenov, and then I really like my Bohemian Grove one. Don't you have some of theirs too?
Some of the Red Pill Thread shirts.
Correct.
Yeah, dude. I have one of the Dead Pedophiles Do Not Reoffend, and I didn't realize that I had thrown it on. I went to go talk to the local paramedic. He was the director for. He's no longer, so I'll put it on blast a little bit. But at the time, he was the director of paramedic medicine here for the small county that I moved back to. So I went in to go, talk to him and about like volunteer opportunities or just, general stuff. At the time, I was thinking about maybe continuing on in paramedic pre-hospital medicine for a little bit. Totally didn't realize that I was wearing that shirt. And I walked in, and this dude was just like, gave me the like up, down, and like real kind of, he slowly shook my hand. And I'm like, why is this dude being so weird? Then I get up and leave, and I realize I'm wearing the skull with Dead Pedophiles Don't Reoffend on it. And I'm like, oh.
I mean, I wouldn't have had that reaction to that shirt. I've been like, fuck yeah, dude.
Well, I know, right? But this dude was a little bit younger of a guy. He seemed very college educated, is what I'll say. I
mean, I'm college educated a few times.
That's I was trying to like put a picture in your head, very second lieutenant.
A little bit nerdy of a guy.
Yeah.
Well, we do have Ratchet and Alicia Victoria in the chat. Alicia Victoria says she's got the new sweater. I'm going to assume maybe you've got the one without a hood. With the Watchfire logo on it. And then she says she's got the Appeal to Heaven as well. Ratchet says their customer support is great. Yeah, I agree. They are for sure. There we are. Some familiar faces in there. Laura Blades, Astrotech 2. What's up, guys? Appreciate you jumping in for the show. This is part 2 of the series on Balin. If you haven't watched the last one, definitely recommend watching. I'm pretty sure you guys have all seen it, the ones that are in live chat right now. But if you're watching it sitting in the corner like a weirdo, being quiet, not engaging in the live chat, and you haven't watched the first part, I definitely recommend watching it because we're going to talk about some things that probably will not make sense to you. And unless you already know this story, if you are a big fan of the Arthurian legends, and you already know Sir Balin, maybe you've read some Sir Thomas Malory or some Alfred Lord Tennyson already about him, you can hang out. If you can hang out anyway, I don't care. Either way, probably worth it to you to go back and watch episode 1 though. But yeah, dude, I think it's time we just jump right in with this. It's really cool to see all you guys in the live chat jumping in for the Watch Post episodes and or the Outpost episodes. But like I said, if you haven't watched this last episode, definitely would like you guys to. It'll help you guys out. The episode is going to get more of the point of the story of Balin. If you guys remember, Balin basically, he passes every single test that the Arthurian court essentially knows how to give him, right? They basically recognize him as somebody who is a pauper, as it were, and eventually sort of earns his keep inside the court. So Chris, what do you think? Excuse me, you got to check back at the story. What did you think about it when we got done last time?
I'm really glad that we went through it, and I thought we did a really good job setting it up right? So if you guys haven't seen part one or you're catching this live stream, definitely go back and run through it, because you did a really good job like lining up the entire thing and knocking it out point by point. But there was some things about our conversation as we were going through it that I legitimately had to go back and like drill down deeper into. And then obviously I have the gift of foreknowledge about what we're talking about tonight. And so like some of the other brief characters that you're going to talk about across ancient literature, I was like, oh man. And then like watching, seeing the similarities and stuff. This has been as much of a learning experience for me prepping for this series as and I'm not trying to blow sunshine up your ass when I say this. It has been as much of a learning experience for me prepping for this series as any college class that I've ever taken on a certain topic.
Well, I definitely think that it has been for me too, because you run through a whole gambit of things trying to get to some of this stuff. Because as you remember from the last time, we went all the way back through the history of where Arthur comes from, the pre and post Vulgate cycles and some of these Welsh poets and things like that, French poets and all of this, jumping into JSTOR, which if you guys have never used JSTOR before, I highly recommend. If you've got a library account, your local library, you can get a JSTOR. If you've got a student account at a college that you're enrolled in, you can get a JSTOR account. Sometimes even if you're like a state or a federal government employee, you can get a JSTOR account and get in there. It's literally every source that you could ever think of is inside of there, and I highly recommend JSTOR. But the cool thing I think about Balin the most is that this is not a recording of a real event, and really none of the Arthurian legends are per se. But they were written with the intent on handing something forward allegorically about meaning and men, and what sort of qualities you should have, and not necessarily what you should have, but what you do have, and then how you have to understand how to employ those things, right? So you ask like who Balin is when you read this story, like what some of the other knights are, who Galahad is, who Gawain is, who Arthur is, who Lancelot is, and all that other stuff. And there's a bunch of other older stories that you can sort of tie into that, but right now it's meant for you here in the present to understand and then to get an answer from. So, and these guys like Sir Thomas Malory or Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote some of that stuff with that in mind, knowing they were passing down essentially knowledge, right? That's one of the jobs that you should have as a man, as a person, as a citizen, is to hand down the knowledge that you have. It's basically how all of human information transferred throughout probably the majority of our history. And obviously we started writing things down, but definitely all of that stuff, especially in your family, right? Family histories, a lot of that stuff travels by word of mouth. But
oh yeah,
one of the things about Balin certainly is that he's often described essentially as a victim of fate, right? He gets these prophecies about his future. Obviously, when he draws a sword, he's told what he's going to do. So he's got several major events that essentially depend on information that he doesn't have, but has no problem acting anyway. He doesn't understand too, right near the end of the story where the kingdoms are laid to waste. He doesn't know that he's picking up the spear of Longinus, and that he doesn't know that when he stabs Pelham that he's committing sacrilege. He doesn't know essentially that when he hands over his shield, to go joust to the knight of the island, that it's actually his brother. He repeatedly puts himself in situations where the consequences are always larger than the information he has that is available to him. And this is one of those paradoxes, because there's that famous quote about like a good plan now is better than a perfect plan later.
Oh yeah.
This goes a lot deeper than that, because there's foreknowledge, there's also rashness and recklessness that gets tied into that. And he makes decisions about them and he owns them. We remember from the story, he takes accountability for some of these things, and obviously he makes poor decisions when he kills the Lady of the Lake, and Arthur kicks him out of the court. Merlin warns him that he's going to commit the dolorous strike, and essentially warns him later that he's going to continue to fail, and there's all this tragedy around him. And it essentially comes from the prophecies that he's given, and then his incomplete knowledge, and then his character. And the tragedy of it all is that he's a brave and loyal knight. As we remember, he has no problem going out and cracking the skulls of Arthur's enemies to try to get back in his good favor, which goes back to, like I said, brave and loyal, but also an extremely capable person, sincerely trying to do the right thing, which is the crux of all of this. But his recurring weakness is his lack of judgment. Right. And the point is that when several duties of yours collide as a man,
Mm.
he has difficulty deciding which duty essentially should govern his mind moving forward through what it is he's going through, which is something I think that all of us can really relate to, especially as fathers and husbands.
100%. I think it's really interesting, the duopathy kind of between the fact that he is described as such a victim of his own fate, or such a tragic figure, when he's
Mm.
ultimately in the driver's seat the entire time.
The
And I
whole
and I
time.
mean like
Perfect.
gas, pedal to the floor,
Yeah.
driving all of these events, and yet
He's kind of
still.
got one gear, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that is very interesting. And there's a lot of points that I'm geared up to make tonight that I think are very poignant for uh, exactly things that we are going through right now, and especially like the
Mm.
powers that
As a
be.
society.
The powers that be, like politically, societally, and culturally, that people would I think that there are powers that be that are seeking to put men in this exact situation, to where
Definitely
either
agree.
they feel like they're a victim of their own fate, and so then there's nothing that they can do about it, right? And so then that's kind of where like narcissism, or not narcissism, excuse me, but nihilism would then lead you into total despair, or they're hoping that you take the other Balinian route. You like how I did that? And
Mm.
look and constantly look without leaping, or misidentify the fight entirely. And that's where my mind is going tonight with everything that we're going to break down.
Yeah, no, the looking before you leap thing, the whole time reading into this and sort of putting this together for everybody, I was thinking about this meme I see ever so often. You've probably seen it too, but it's like a German shepherd who's leaping off the edge of a cliff after like a bird. And the words on the screen say that decisions made in anger are final.
Mm,
And so the dog may get the bird, but he's now over the edge of the cliff and is going to fall,
right. Yeah.
and that's kind of one of the lessons. I just was envisioning that meme the whole time you were talking about it, and you pointed it out as well. But let's just jump in, dude, and get into some of this stuff, because one of the other things that we're going to do is make some comparisons to other stories from the West, which is a point here to show you that there's a rich heritage of lessons that you can go study, of other examples of archetypes and men that you can go back to and look at these flawed individuals, like all of us are as men and women, citizens of a country. And we're going to talk about how there's overlaps, and to show meaning rather than to show redundancy, right? We're showing meaning that there are multiple times across multiple eons of human history where the same point needed to be made, right? And the comparisons in this are structural comparisons, right? They're like with Arthur, there's no evidence that Balin is like directly tied to, or that he was a retelling of some of these stories, right? So like the story of Achilles or Oedipus and Sigurd and some of these others that I'll compare him to. And Balin appears obviously later. He appears in the 13th century French prose traditions, especially the post-Vulgate suite that I talked about, excuse me, the last time, and then Sir Thomas Malory. But there's not an earlier story that quite maps onto Balin's life, scene for scene, that way. And the older stories are important too, because Balin shares like recognizable tragic structures inside some of these stories. And kind of with the point here, not redundancy, but continuing to learn these lessons. And some of those structures we'll get into are prophecy, and this foreknowledge concept. And we'll get into the Christian meaning as well of prophecy too. But dangerous gifts is another thing. Divided loyalties and mistaken identity, destruction of loved ones, and then obviously learning about things after it's too late, like knowledge arriving after your irreversible action. Decisions made in anger are final. So each of these is going to exist like the last episode in its own silo, but they're tied together. And we'll go back to Balin's other name in French is Balin le Savage or le Sauvage, or however the Frenchies say it. But like I said, I mentioned in the first episode, I'm going to explain it a little more here. I went into it some then. This is meant to just give you some more context. But Sir Thomas Malory calls him Balin le Sauvage. And in older French, it can mean, like I said, wild or untamed or solitary. Hence this theme of him being in prison as he begins the story outside of courtly life, but belongs to it because if we remember, he is of gentle birth, meaning that he comes from both a mother and father who are royalty, or at least they are the upper crust. And this name essentially is meant to distance Balin from settled courtly life and then the brutality of what exists outside of it, and where Balin really starts running into trouble. And these honorable characteristics and this courteousness that comes with the Arthurian court, right, and the effectiveness also of Arthur's command that Balin works underneath, just shows that how much he follows counsel and will work strategically to maintain restraint. But when a crisis comes, his judgment kind of goes out the window.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of it is, and this is where we're going to kind of get into some of these other comparisons, but it's driven by insults or fear or a sense of urgency, right? That slow is smooth, smooth is fast, those sorts of things. And then later on, well past when Sir Thomas Malory is writing, Alfred Lord Tennyson as well, he keeps like a different version of Balin, more so somebody with like a violent temper is sort of central to Balin's character there, which is, like I said, it's different than Sir Thomas Malory, who has more of a control in there. His anger isn't like this constant theme throughout the story. But the real big pattern in that is obviously narrowed judgment when something is going on. And you remember in the story, Balin does have a conscience. He mourns Columba, the female who perishes in the incident with the Invisible Knight. He cares, obviously, that he's pissed off King Arthur. He hears survivors of the wastelands after the Dolorous Strike, and they curse him as he wanders through the three kingdoms and feels horrified. Essentially, as well, that to learn that he did this and what Merlin tells him, and then again, of course, the regret he feels when he realizes that him and his brother have essentially fought one another to death and has remorse over that. But the other part of this too is that Sir Thomas Malory uses another word, and that word is worship. And in this context, it refers to honor and reputation more so than like a Christian sense of the word worship. And it has more to do with the public standing that a knight would have and carry with him through his conduct. And we'll talk about chivalry as well there too, right? And so a knight's reputation in this period really is his entire value. There's a lot to that with men anyway, but in an honor code as strict as medieval Europe, this is your only currency, right? And you have to depend on lords and you have to depend on other people higher than you. And that is exactly how you were going to get things, and people would trust you. The people need to believe that you're brave and loyal and all of these, very good adjectives about somebody. You're reliable, capable of these things. And that reputation essentially is going to follow you around. People will get to know you as Sir, Chris or Sir Brandon or Sir Balin or whatever your name is. And that name is going to carry weight as you move from town to town. And this is important to this story as well, because these insults about Balin follow him around. And it's not that an insult is essentially treated as like one thing between two different people. It is quite literally a disagreement about your character in public when your character is all you have in public. And I think there's a really good microcosm example of this inside the military, because when you move from base to base or post to post or whatever, who you are as a person is going to follow you. And I think Chris will back me up in saying that typically when you find out somebody new is coming, the first thing you do is look for somebody who knew that person. And you're either going to get, good things, bad things, or indifferent. I don't know this person or whatever.
Is he a shitbag?
Is he a shitbag? Basically. Right. Yeah. Well, and a good sign of your humility with that is if you allow yourself to be openly, talked about like that and own your bullshit, essentially, right? And the other half of that too is if you know things about you are being said that are wrong, you should defend yourself. But in chivalry and the code, right? In this code we're talking about, to be openly humiliated and do nothing about it would be seen as weakness. This is sort of the point about strength here and rights and what exactly power is in a world like this. But he's very sensitive. Balin is very sensitive to these sorts of insults after being released from prison, everything that he does essentially after leaving Arthur's court. And this is basically his downfall, is why he has to deal with these things, knowing he's making these decisions, trying to do the right thing, not being able to handle sort of the pressures that he's gotten under. And I do you think that that example of the military sort of is a good way to like explain the world Balin sort of sits inside of?
Yeah, absolutely. And people that have spent time inside of the military are going to recognize that. Um, and it's kind of a lot easier for people who've lived in that type of structure. Maybe not even necessarily just military, but also like LE, fire,
Oh
really
yeah,
public service
EMS probably.
in general. Because we walk around with our entire, or at least a bulk of our reputation on our chests at all
Hmm.
times. When you look at rank, in the army,
Yeah.
like all of your skill badges you're wearing right there, right? So if you have a ranger
Mm.
tab on your left shoulder, and then you've got your free fall badge, and you've got your like whatever you have, right? The scuba bubble,
Right.
like you're going to look at somebody like that, and automatically you're going to assign a certain amount of like a gravitas that goes with that reputation that they're wearing. And I'm sure like our Ellie and Fire Bros and everybody can kind of talk about the same. When you see like a certain amount of rank carries gravitas with it, right? I think like maybe the best way to describe it inside of the corporate world would be like
Mm.
if you have an office in the corner or whatever, or you're high enough that you have a room that belongs to you with a name tag on the outside, then
Hmm.
it carries that with you. But a long way to say I think that's a perfect way to describe it. And then kind of
Yeah.
to go back a little bit earlier when you were talking about his kind of Balin's main character trait, right? I would sum it up by saying like he suffers from the ultimate target fixation, is kind of like what we would say
Mm.
in the military, or
Hmm.
tunnel vision, right? Is like
Hmm.
the way that other
Sure.
people would describe it. But that's kind of like what popped into
Yeah.
my head while you were
Tunnel
going through that.
vision, but also some hubris. Because if you remember,
Definitely.
when the lady gives him the sword and she tells him that there's a negative prophecy associated with it, he essentially behaves like he's going to be bigger than the prophecy,
Mhm.
which definitely ties into hubris. But like I said before, the first person I want to compare him to is Achilles, and I think there's some great overlaps here. Balin obviously is a great warrior too. He's not considered the best in all of Greece or all of France the way that Achilles is in Greece, but his rashness to action is very similar and has very similar outcomes to Achilles. They are both also bound by prophecy and then tie themselves to something that wreaks havoc and creates, their end. Obviously, Achilles is told that he can either go to the Trojan War and die, but his name will live forever, or he can essentially not go and then live a longer life, but his name will disappear into, from history. And Achilles and Balin are both, like I said, exceptional warriors, but they both create all of their larger problems essentially when they are dealt a personal injury that drives their decisions. And in the Iliad, begins obviously with Achilles. He's being publicly humiliated by Agamemnon. Agamemnon takes Briseis away from him, and he responds by refusing to fight for the Greeks, or continuing to fight for the Greeks. And then, because he's the best warrior in the Greek army, that essentially affects everybody around him. They start losing more men. They start losing some of these battles, some of their strongest fighters, right? He's removed himself from the war over an insult to his honor and what he feels like he's owed. And then later, before he returns, Patroclus is killed. And then when he does come back, his anger is much more worse. And he kills, obviously, Hector, and then continues to abuse Hector's body even after their fight is over. And at that point, he's no longer simply like correcting a wrong that was done to him. His anger over what happened with Agamemnon, and then obviously the death of Patroclus is sort of taken him beyond what that situation probably required or should have required. And that's kind of the way Balin is too, this sort of like sensitivity to honor. And there's a difference is that, Achilles obviously usually understands the choice he's making a lot more clearly than Balin. And I think you can really see that evidence in the fact that Achilles knows if he removes himself from the war, the Greeks are going to feel that pain. There's not this like awareness inside the story of Balin that Balin's decisions are going to create some of this stuff. And Achilles knows what he's staying at Troy for. And but Balin, like Achilles, receives warnings, but Balin essentially rarely understands the full situation until he's acted. Whereas, Achilles will learn the gravity of his decisions, but is a little bit more aware of them. And Achilles understands his fate as well a lot more clearly than Balin. He knows he's going to die at Troy. His mother tells him that if he stays at Troy, he will die young, obviously. But Balin doesn't ever receive that same sort of clear expectation. He's warned that this sword he's taken, which gives him the name of the Knight of the Two Swords, is going to destroy him, but he's not aware how. He also doesn't greet it the same way. Achilles sort of greets this with, open arms, that he's going to die. Balin says, I just basically will take whatever adventure is set before me, but doesn't really take the warning with the same level of seriousness. He also doesn't know that, he's going to kill his brother, doesn't assume that that's that person, then obviously doesn't know that he's going to do what he's going to do in King Pellam's castle. But that's that's where the story started to differ. But what I think Achilles helps people most, I'm talking to men mostly in this situation, helps us understand what can happen when honor and anger take control of you and you let these emotions, which are imposters of the moment, right, take over you as a person. And Balin sort of has an extra layer to that problem. Sometimes the strength you have as a man to make decisions, without having all the information, there's a lesson inside of that too. That's why I think that his lesson here, and why we begin with him, is really strong. It's more for people who would see themselves as strong rather than, I think, men who see themselves as weak. Quite frankly, that's where this lesson really sits. I think that having a lot of personal strength sort of creates this moral asymmetry that you have. The stronger that you are, the less room that you have to be careless, with your impulses. Mistakes don't necessarily remain contained to yourself as well. I think that's pretty evident, especially as somebody who's a father, right? But your anger can become sort of this policy that you have that governs your behavior. And then the pride you get from that is a punishment. And you realize some of these faults. And there's like a level of certainty, I think, as well. Sort of that can become a burden when you realize these things, a burden on yourself and these thoughts you may have post situation. But it essentially points to the fact that the internal strength that you have, or the strength that you have, needs to be governed internally or from within yourself. That if you have this power and strength inside of you as a person, that power can't depend on everybody else around it to restrain it every time you make a poor decision. That you have to have the mental faculty to restrain yourself. That restraint has to exist before something like this happens, which requires you to work through these situations and understand your strengths and weaknesses, so that when something like this does happen, your ability to act will always outrun your ability to judge what's in front of you. And that's really the problem that Balin has. And I think that his strength really is developed further than his judgment, is the point I'm trying to make. And he can act faster than he can understand. Sort of the way sometimes people's mouths run a lot faster, than their brains, and they sort of say things that they regret or make decisions that they regret, because he is a very capable person. But there's a wide delta between his capability and his ability to judge. And that becomes a catastrophic mistake several times throughout this story. And so it's not that danger, there's strength in danger. Essentially, it's essentially that you have an obligation when you are strong, essentially, to understand your limits and then understand how to govern your own judgment before your decisions create consequences that you can't alter.
Yeah, something as you were going through that just absolutely dawned on me too. And I love it when this happens in real time, which is why you should read and then reread things, because you're always going to come across something new multiple times through. But understanding that chivalry code and the importance of honor, like you were describing, all of a sudden I realized that Balin, coming straight out of the dungeon, drawing the
Mhm.
sword that was presented to him by the lady is really like his first great deed, and shows that he is one without treachery and without treason, and basically becomes the only uh like how man
Metric.
yeah, the only metric by which other people are now showing him respect, right? And so maintaining that item on him um, does become that metric again that he can show and walk around and be like, yes, I was the guy that drew the sword. Now it now defines him. Like early on. So
Mm.
now I can understand why there was even more temptation on him not just handing it back over, but being like, I earned this. It's a little bit more than just pride and this is mine now because I was able to take it. Like, no, this defines, like you said, I am one without treason and treachery. And as long as I have this, I can show that. Like, it is
Hmm.
tangible. And
Right.
yeah.
Well, remember too, she lets everybody try it. Arthur tries first, and all of the other knights and the lords inside the court try. And then she goes to leave before he stands up and says, "You've forgotten me," right?
Right.
And he basically makes a comment about like not judging a book by its cover, and then he goes to try, and then he's able to pull it out really easy. So it sort of begins with this like, you're underestimating me,
Mm-hmm.
and that once he's able to do it, it takes all of that a step further to what you were saying.
Yep.
So it completely and totally begins from this needing to prove yourself kind of thing. And I like the way that you frame the sword as the tangible evidence of this, competence and strength, essentially, more perceived confidence than actual competence.
Well, yeah, because
Yeah, I think.
as long as he wears it in front of King Arthur and in front of all the other knights, it is a reminder
Yeah,
that
and he.
this you were unable to do this, but I was, right?
Mm,
So, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and he even is given the accolades about that too from Arthur and the rest of rest of them when the knights there are jealous that he's able to do it, right? You
Yeah.
can take that as a negative, or you can take that as recognized greatness essentially in that moment. People aren't jealous of things they don't like
Mm,
or things that they know they don't lack. You know what I'm saying?
exactly. Yeah, for
Sort of
sure.
really ties into the next comparison I want to make, and kind of keeping with this ancient literature theme, bouncing off of Achilles is into Aeneas, right? And Virgil defines essentially Aeneas by this concept called pietas, and essentially pietas is a Roman concept that is broader than what we usually would understand piety as, and obviously pietas is where piety comes from. But in the Roman sense, it is a disciplined sense of duty toward the gods and your family, especially your community, the obligations that you've inherited from the past. Remember that most Roman men, especially those a part of the upper class of Romans, would have grown up with wax masks of their forefathers and the ancestors that came before them, just to sort of show these young men the patrimony they came from. And those wax masks would be worn out into the forum when one of them died, essentially as a way to represent the deeds that family did in Rome. So there was this huge tie that all Roman men essentially were held to. Roman virtue really is a very unique concept, and one that is different, I would say, too, from like a modern Western view like today. It's not limited to like private goodness or like individual sincerity, because I would say that it has more to do with how you are fulfilling your place within the larger Roman order, kind of like the example I just gave about the wax masks in the forum. And I think that talking about Roman virtue has a lot more to do with like the point of the Outpost episodes writ large, right? This is kind of the point of these, is tying you into all of the past. But other examples of these virtues or virtues in Latin would be courage and excellence, right? Gravitas was one, fides, loyalty, constantia, right? Steadfastness under pressure, which is something that ties into Balin, disciplina, discipline, the ability obviously to submit your personal desire to duty and order. And when Virgil writes Aeneas, and we know like obviously Aeneas is tied to the future of Rome, Pietas is what Rome ties itself to, essentially, because Aeneas embodies all of those Roman virtues by accepting the hardship from the point of leaving Troy all the way through to like the end of his days, right? And he is a relevant example, essentially, of this strength that's organized around obligation, which obviously ties into Balin as well. And they have different outcomes. And if you remember, when Troy is falling, finally, Aeneas leaves with his dad out of the city, and essentially putting duty to his family before anything else, before trying to save the city. After the horses inside the city, and then obviously later he leaves Dido, who from Carthage. The choice essentially is one where he is trying to decide whether he's going to stay and create a family. He genuinely loves her, but essentially he knows that his greater duty is across the sea in Italy, quote unquote Italy, and that basically he has to put his private happiness aside for essentially founding Rome. And then Virgil also puts Aeneas in a lot of different situations, essentially too, inside of the Iliad, or excuse me, the Aeneid, where he has two good things going on at the same time that are competing interests, and he routinely chooses the appropriate one. And, there's some examples too where like his humanness shows, but it's very, very different. He does go on to be the person who sort of lays the initial foundations for what would eventually become, the city of Rome. And that right there, I think, is why the Romans chose this concept of pietas, and why pietas ties so much into this story, because it's the ability to live inside of a hierarchy of obligations. And this is a really difficult thing to navigate day to day. Obviously, you have a lot of loyalties, especially, as a man or a woman, right? You have loyalty to your friends, your job, your country, you have, religion, all these things that you're loyalty to. And you have to have the moral maturity, right, to understand that those duties essentially are going to conflict one another at any point during the day or any point in your life. Two of these big obligations these obligations may be really large inside your life and conflict with each other in serious ways. And I don't say all of that to say that Balin doesn't believe in duty, because he obviously does, and his actions do that, essentially show that he understands the concept of duty, essentially. But Balin sees one obligation, and clearly, understands and fails essentially to hold that there are competing obligations long enough to prioritize them and make a decision that's going to not wind up with these terrible outcomes. There is an example that doesn't have the dire consequences that Balin faces at the end of the Aeneid, but Aeneas sees the belt of Pallas Athena on a character named Turnus, and he kills him. And essentially, the sight of the dead body, which is described as a trophy in the story, overwhelms Aeneas, and the discipline essentially that he has spent this entire poem trying to maintain the whole time, and just shows how difficult like the concept of pietas is, and not everybody is famous, but then, or not famous, but everybody is successful at it. But Aeneas goes on to continue to do his duty and heads toward that duty with success. And that's the contrast here between Aeneas and Balin, I think, is where the lesson exists, because he's trying to repeatedly do the right thing, and he's trying to reach the obligation that has, the highest, requires the highest submission of the self to this, right? And even when essentially that costs him, like example, the love of Dido, he still does it anyway. And Balin does know that several duties exist at once, but he is not consistently ranking them before he is taking taking action. And I think that moral code there, the Roman concept of the Roman virtues, and then the chivalric code essentially that Balin lives inside of, is a really good example of how to basically learn from these two different things. Protecting your family, obeying lawful and then religious authority, the vengeance of wrongdoing, like in the examples that I gave with Balin. All of those things are good. But the hard part is essentially not succumbing to the pressure of all of them at once. And basically, the valuable comparison there is that, the story is largely about learning to live underneath your own governed order and not necessarily order around you that exists as a third party to your own personal decisions.
Yeah, 100%. My key takeaway from everything that you just said was the maturity aspect, and that I think is the lesson that we're supposed to learn here, is to become mature and learn balance, right? Because if you are all courage and no wisdom, then you become reckless.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly what Balin shows us. He is constantly impetuous. He's reckless, and there is a total lack of discernment about when and where, proper time and a place for application of what he sees as justice. And even though it may be right that justice was done to the Lady of the Lake who had his mother killed, proper
Mm-hmm.
time and proper place was his crime against King Arthur. And then you see that repeated almost, to the letter, at King Pelham's feast, where he
Mm-hmm.
sees Garlon, and it may be right and just to see justice done to him, but proper time, proper place. He lacked the discernment
Yeah.
to rank that stuff, to rank those in the order that they should be in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, I agree with you. All of that is what comes with maturity, right?
I think there's so much allegory inside that situation in King Pelham's castle because you're talking about prioritizing decisions, and that decision he makes in the court there leaves him with no decisions. And I think that it is basically mirrored in his quest inside the castle to try to find something to defend himself with, but he can no longer defend him. He has nothing to defend himself with. And I think it sort of shows you the nakedness, I guess, that you become when you put yourself in those situations. And so like the lack of weapons in the hallways and the other rooms, sort of like no exits anymore from the decisions you made, and that you can either meet your fate, which would have been to stop and answer to like Pelham's justice inside the court, which is the moral and ethical anchor that you as a knight have agreed to, this chivalric code, right? Or you do something incredibly rash without knowing what it is you're doing, and that's always an option, whatever it is, something dangerous, and you're taking a mighty risk in doing that. And then obviously that's the decision that he makes, and without knowing it, obviously creates waste for three kingdoms and collapses a castle. But I just think that whole sequence of him looking for a weapon and not being able to find anything really is one of the biggest allegorical points to this whole story about how naked you become when you put yourselves in situations where you have no other decisions other than to face justice or to do something completely irrational,
Quite literally goes back to your meme with the German Shepherd. When you look without leaping, now
Right.
you've left yourself with no options.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Well, and that too, like, right. The next, I think, probably the strongest classical comparison for Balin is what's up?
This argument about what color your chair is just super distracting.
Oh, I saw that. I saw that. Yeah.
Somebody was asking what brand your chair is or whatever, because they said they love it.
I would have to look again. I don't remember, guys. Sorry. Let me move out the way. Can you see it? Can you see it, Chris?
GT Playa. That's what it says.
GT. There you go. GT Playa. That's me, dude. GT Playa.
Lisa.
Oedipus, right? A very good comparison for Balin, I think, because both stories are concerned with what a person is responsible for when they act without fully understanding the situation completely. And so Oedipus is a play by Sophocles, and the primary city inside the play is Thebes. And in the play, Thebes is being destroyed by another plague. Oedipus is the king. He takes responsibility for essentially finding the cause of the plague and learns that the city is polluted because of the murder of the former king, a king named Laius. And there's never been essentially justice for the murder of that king. And Oedipus begins searching for the killer because he believes that finding the killer and punishing that person will save Thebes from this plague. And basically, in the course of this investigation to find the killer, he winds up looking introspectively at himself. Because years earlier, before becoming king of Thebes, he killed a stranger during a confrontation at a crossroads. He did not know that that stranger was actually Laius. He also didn't know that Laius was his biological father. And that also, after arriving in Thebes, Oedipus married a widowed queen named Jocasta without knowing that she was his mom. And this is where this whole concept, right, of the Oedipus complex comes from in psychology. But the tragedy here, and all of these stories have tragedy, but is made completely worse by the fact that Oedipus has already been told about this prophecy that's been governing his life. The same with Achilles, the same with Aeneas, the same with Balin. And he's had been told essentially that he would kill his father and marry his mother. But he believed that the people that raised him, two people, Polybus and Merope of a different city, I believe it's Corinth, were his actual biological parents. And so he leaves Corinth to try to protect them. And in that process, this is very Kung Fu Panda. Actually, one meets their fate on the road to avoid it. But that's exactly what happens here, because he doesn't actually know who his real parents are, and essentially his attempt to avoid this prophecy actually helps put him on the road to fulfill this prophecy. And that gives Oedipus a very specific kind of situation and then classical tragedy, because he's acting on information that is reasonable information, but it is not complete information. He knows this prophecy, but he doesn't know that he's the person inside of that prophecy. He knows that at one point he killed a guy at a crossroads without knowing that it was his dad. He knows that he married the Queen of Thebes without realizing that it was his actual mother. And the facts that would have probably changed the meaning of his actions are only learned after he's essentially gone too far, and those actions can't be undone, which is the same sort of position that Balin repeatedly finds himself inside of, like this situation, searching for a sword or a spear or a mace or an axe or something like this through the halls of King Pelham's castles. He knows that the sword that he was given came with a prophecy. He just doesn't know how it's going to end, and seems to show a decent amount of hubris about it. And he knows essentially that when he gets to King Pelham's castle, he knows that what he's going to do, King Pelham is going to try to kill him. He doesn't realize what he's going to do, and then winds up in this situation again. And the important connection is that neither Oedipus or Balin are innocent because they lack the information, if that makes sense. Then Oedipus doesn't know that Laius is his father and Jocasta are his mom. And then obviously Balin doesn't know the things that he's going to do. But essentially it's a question of the guilt that they're going to feel about it. And, as people, we obviously act, without complete knowledge sometimes. We often would prefer to have complete knowledge before we act, and we make decisions on the things that we see and the things that we think that we know. But the important information that we're missing, we often think reduces our responsibility in the outcomes, if that makes sense. And sometimes we sort of find ourselves like dramatically reduced in our responsibility for those things. And we sort of see that this like incomplete knowledge means that we're excused, and that, ignorance essentially is a replacement for, or some sort of like moral equal for not knowing about it and not taking accountability at the same time. And in Oedipus, the play, it sort of shows this relationship between ignorance and morality pretty well, because he couldn't know that the stranger at the crossroads was his dad, but Sophocles still essentially shows that he is the kind of person that when met with confrontation is going to meet it with violent anger, sort of proving that he is who he is regardless of his ignorance of this one situation. And the prophecy as well that he's given about his mother and his father is not what creates this proclivity for violence that he has. It just creates the circumstances where he plays his part in this prophecy, and the results just wind up being catastrophic. And the same is true for Balin as well. the fate he has doesn't necessarily force him to become that person. He makes that decision even after he's warned, and he shows his proclivity for this over and over and over again throughout the story. It's not necessarily the sword that is making him act this way. He does get placed in these positions where, his habits matter enormously, but it's not necessarily that it's his ignorance is going to excuse him from these things. And, again, that philosophical connection between Balin and Oedipus essentially is the choice between fate and responsibility, as essentially only one of those can be true at the same time, right? Circumstances can limit what you're able to know, while your character as a person still shapes what is done with the knowledge that you have. And then discovering the full truth after your actions and trying to use that ignorance as an excuse for not being responsible is a lesson you have to learn, that you were always that person who would make that mistake. Your lack of information in the moment doesn't mean that you weren't. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. I feel like the biggest lesson to take away as far as that front goes is that you have to have the humility to grow. Because Balin shows that he's the same guy that makes the same impetuous mistakes in the end of his ballad when he's fighting his brother as the guy in the very beginning that refused to give the sword back. And he, like I was talking about last week, his character growth, his character arc is a flat line. It never goes anywhere. And so because of that, he keeps making the same mistakes over and over and over. And it keeps leading him to the same places. In fact, like his situation devolves and gets worse because there is no introspection on his behalf to stop and be like, okay, well, I did this last time and it didn't work out well for me. Maybe I try a different way about it this time. Nope, the same way that he went after the Lady of the Lake is the same way that he went after Garlon, and is the same way that he ends up going after his brother in the end of the story. Zero introspection, zero growth, zero humility. And in that, I think that the author is obviously trying to tell you, like, you need to be able to look inside of yourself, recognize the things that you are doing that is wrong, as it were, the mistakes you're making, own them and grow from them, or you are going to find yourself in the same cycles.
It's very childish too, right? How often you have kids just like I do. I didn't know, or maybe even a coworker. You've probably seen this with young soldiers as well. That's fine, but it doesn't mean that you're excused from your decisions because you didn't know something.
Right. Yeah.
I think that that's a very sophisticated concept too, that even a lot of other adults don't really understand, because I hear adults say that all the time. Well, I didn't know.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, your decision still led to an outcome.
Yeah.
And, even if that outcome
Are you still speeding?
Yeah, sure. The whole ignorance of the law is not an excuse or whatever. But I mean, there's so many other smaller ways that people say that all the time. And more often than not, like, I think that when people say that out loud, they're talking to themselves more than they are talking to everybody around them. And I think it has to do with this concept of guilt that I mentioned inside the lesson about Oedipus, as well, as that this guilt is a measurement of how you're going to rise up out of this situation. But it requires both the acknowledgement of that guilt, and then, of course, the subsequent recognition that you're responsible regardless of your innocence, or you're not your innocence, but your ignorance is just, I think it's a complex concept that some people have a very hard time espousing themselves to,
Absolutely. There's this perception today that intentions are all that matter, immaterial of outcomes, and that as long as my intentions were noble or moral or good, then I can't be held responsible. I'm insulated from the outcomes of those decisions. You see this all the time in kind of progressive leftist thinking, especially when it comes to these like
Mm.
social welfare programs that they always want to institute. The first one that
Yeah.
comes into my mind is like the housing initiative that they did in Portland, Oregon. Well, this community doesn't have houses. You know, my intention is to see these people have homes because they don't have them. So since my
Mm.
intention is good, it doesn't matter that the outcome is all I did was take taxpayer money, provide them homes, and then they stripped those homes and sold whatever they could pull out, the copper wire and everything, to get more drugs. And basically, like, lives were continually destroyed because I didn't go after the root cause of the problem. Because my
Mm.
intention was noble and to give them a home, I'm insulated from the negative outcomes of that. And that's just not the case. To your point that you were making earlier, it doesn't matter that you didn't know. Your actions directly led to this, and you are going to uh, reap the consequences of your actions. And eventually, we all get to a place where society can't insulate you any further, where other people can't get you off the hook any further. For some people, it may not be till they stand in judgment before God, but eventually everybody comes to a place where the outcomes of your actions are going to be weighed. And
Mhm.
it's a little I don't have a better word to describe this, but it's a little kind of low-hanging fruit to say, but the highway to hell is paved with good intentions,
Yeah,
and you still
absolutely.
find yourself in hell at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely, man. Life is not an etch a sketch. You know what I'm saying? A stupid way of saying that, but it really is. I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah.
How often we think and wish that we could change decisions just like that. But there's another comparison too that I want to talk about with an Icelandic poem. Basically, it's called the Volsunga Saga. It's like I said, it's Icelandic. It comes and it splices both Norse, like Scandinavian, and then Germanic heroic traditions. But this is the story of Sigurd. Sigurd kills a dragon in this story. The dragon, his name is Fafnir, and after he kills the dragon, Sigurd takes possession of the treasure that Fafnir has been guarding, which sounds very Hobbit-like, and that's on purpose, right? But the saga essentially is about the larger legend of the Volsung family, and there's all these other stories essentially that are tied into it, and then these stories about this family get put into a bunch of other poetry throughout time. But Sigurd is actually one of the great heroic figures of Northern Europe, Germany, Denmark, some of these other places. And there's a lot of, related versions of this in older Norse poetry as well, and some older German stuff. But his name is Siegfried inside the older Germanic tradition, which if you've seen Django, there's a big reference to Siegfried in that movie. Love Django. But the treasure that he takes over essentially from the dragon is cursed. That cursed doesn't work essentially like a spell like you would get from like a magician. The treasure essentially becomes dangerous because you want it. That your desire for that treasure is what becomes lethal. Bargaining over it, the people will and throughout the story betray one another for the story or the treasure, and obviously that betrayal comes with like killing one another for it. But the curse itself or the treasure creates pressure that's put on the human beings inside the story, something that the dragon is able to essentially resist. And the human beings still, they are the lesson there because of their reactions to the pressure they feel because of the treasure. And it's this theme over again inside of this story about Sigurd, that the pressure that you feel about something, not necessarily the ignorance, but just the erasure of personal responsibility from it. And it gives character a place essentially to reveal itself is how you react to that pressure. The sword is the effective, I think, comparison here, the treasure and then the sword that he takes. The damsel tells him essentially that he's cursed by taking it. He doesn't care and he does it anyway. The sword is more of a weapon. It's tied to essentially what you said earlier, about it being Balin's own understanding of himself. It's how he sees himself now. It's like you said, it's this tangible evidence that he can be good and that other people can see value inside of him. And human beings in general, often I think confuse being worthy of receiving something with being wise enough to wield it, if that makes sense. And this is also a lesson inside of Count of Monte Cristo as well.
Great book.
You know, at Edmond Dantes, he's thrown into Chateau d'If, and he meets the other prisoner inside, whose name is escaping me right now. And he eventually learns of this treasure.
Oh.
And throughout the course of this story, he's being, you know, led down this path of reason and being taught these things about, you know, warfare and study and philosophy. And eventually he comes to this realization that he was betrayed by his best friend. And this schooling essentially that he goes to in prison, unjustly imprisoned, by the way, and he's unfettered eventually by the circumstances he was in, but that's not how he went into prison. But he becomes essentially, through this process, the person who is capable of using this treasure by the point where he's getting out of the Chateau d'If. But if the person who went into the prison is not the same person that leaves it, essentially, in that treasure, and I basically make this example in the Weimar essay I wrote on Substack, but that basically matters because he would have wasted the treasure before. And there's a lesson in here as well. You know, you can sort of earn your own authority and status and influence, you know, over people, and think, you know, essentially that authority you have. And we see this in the military a lot, right? That the authority you have is proof essentially that you're the right person for the job. Those are two very different things, you know. And Balin obviously is worthy of pulling the sword out of the sheath, you know, and that's correct. That's what's supposed to happen. But it immediately places the burden on top of his shoulders that he now has it. What is he going to do with it? And that's the lesson, you know, a step down the road, basically. You know, he never seriously like separates those two concepts inside the story. And that's why, you know, the warning she gives him sort of takes like no effect on him at all. And then Sigurd's treasure as well kind of creates the same problem for him. The treasure obviously has inherent value because it is jewels and gold, all this stuff. You know, it makes, you know, it's hard to separate essentially the object from the lesson there. And once, you know, in the curse of the treasure, once you have possession of it, it's now connected to your identity. And in essence, this concept of your destiny, it puts this pressure on you, as it's described in the story, you know, essentially giving the thing up, you know, kind of begins to feel like you're losing a part of yourself, which is, again, this sword. And the point you made at the beginning of this about it being a tangible evidence of his identity, you know, and it works essentially, I think, in both stories through this concept as well of attachment to this identity. You know, it doesn't need to overpower your will. The hero in the story really only needs to keep choosing, you know, the object, the treasure, or the sword, or whatever, every single time for it to continue to be effective in their lives, and effective in one way or another, a good way or another. And I think that that's why these stories as well have a lot to do with like this concept of power that you get from these identities. Actually, sort of talking about it out loud as well really makes me think about the discussion we had on Friday about self-deception, you know, on the hearth. And like the power that you get kind of rarely looks like a burden, because power feels really, really good. And you kind of start to tell yourselves this, you know, and it arrives to you as a reward and sort of this like self-confirmation of your own ability. But, you know, what you actually have is something way more powerful, because you have now responsibility that didn't exist before inside of you. It's not really, you know, about whether or not you deserved it. It's what you're going to do with it. And so the failure there is not that necessarily you're unworthy of whether it's the sword or the treasure, and the treasure in either Sigurd or Edmond Dantes's story in the Count of Monte Cristo, but that whether or not you are the man who is worthy and responsible enough of wielding it correctly when it falls into your lap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I'm gonna have you. You went a little bit blurry. I don't know if we're having some internet problem. Before we move on, I just want to try and get you back in the studio. So if you want to try and cycle your link really quick, or log out and log back in, so that way.
Yeah, sure.
Your audio was pristine the entire time, but your video just went a little bit blurry. So
Well, that's lame. Sorry, guys. I guess I will be right back.
And then there was one. We'll get Brady back in here, guys, really quick. Maybe your left eye is just blurry. Yeah, there you go. Just stare at him with your right eye then. Hey, that
Is that
looks
better?
100% better. You guys over
Okay.
there,
Yeah.
let me know that he looks better. All right.
I'm going to turn the AC up in here to see if that can prevent that from happening.
No worries.
Because I've got a responsibility to you guys.
I
You know.
love the way that you tied that in. No, dude,
Mhm.
you're 100% right. It's interesting that you went to Sigurd. I had to look that one up. Not gonna lie, that was not a part of my primer, so I
Mhm.
was unfamiliar with it before we started. But the other story that it brought back in my mind was C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because in there, have you read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so when Eustace finds the forbidden treasure in the cave, and it also has a curse that lies on it, and he takes it and he slips the ring on his arm, and then he wakes up a dragon that nobody
Right.
from the Dawn Treader can recognize, and so that obviously goes on to cause him great problems, and the only way that they're able to recognize him is because he starts weeping, obviously, as they're firing at him and essentially trying to kill him because they think that he's trying to take down the ship. But that's where my mind went with it too, and it also goes back to this. The greed of it. There's a coveting of it, obviously, that goes into all of this. But then to tie,
Covetousness, yes, absolutely.
yeah, but then to tie it back into the Balin narrative, it's that again, like he yeah, so covets something that he refuses to give it up. There's that lack of maturity, right, in blowing past the prophecy, and I do believe in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Mhm.
There's some type of writing or something there that warns not to take the treasure, and Eustace obviously ignores it. So you see those parallels there as well. But then also back to Balin, those unintended consequences where now he's left with no options afterwards,
Mhm.
because these are the logical consequences of blowing through the prophecy and failing to heed the words, and now you're
Mhm.
stuck in this situation, obviously.
Mhm.
But at this point, where I'm just rehashing the same
Oh yeah.
morals over and over.
Well, that's totally okay to do because, like I said, we're not talking to be redundant. We're talking to show how much these morals and ethics exist across a wide swath
Right.
of literature, right? People took the time to write them down because they have relevance across thousands of years. We're talking about the Iliad and the Aeneid. At the same time, we're talking about a Norse and Germanic poem, and Tolkien inserts these things into his stories, and C.S. Lewis inserts these things into his stories. And so that's the point. Isn't the redundancy? The point is the fact that it's a lesson that has to be learned over and over and over again, so much that somebody took the time to write it down, and so that just lends. These are pillars supporting these moral and ethical anchors, just showcasing why it is you should take the time to learn and understand them.
And not just write it down, but learned and relearned and taken and repackaged and retold,
Yeah.
different characters, different time, different fantasy, but taking that same
Yeah.
core message and reapplying it over here. Absolutely. It's almost as if our forefathers are trying to get us to pay attention to something, slapping the table,
Right.
as it were.
It's Western. It's the Greek honor culture. It's Norse honor culture. It's Germanic honor culture. It's French honor culture. It's British honor culture. Right.
Mm.
They exist in so many different areas, and then people who would have never even talked to one another, just sort of highlights the humanness of these lessons and that they haven't gone away. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The other element in this, and this is the part I think we're going to really thrive on here, is the concept of providence as well, inside the concept of Christian romance. And I don't mean like love, I mean like the romantic tradition,
Right.
right? um and this is where this concept of like Christianity and prophecy really comes into play, because obviously Balin's story is inside of the medieval world, which of course exists inside of the Christian world. Is It's Christendom, you know what I mean?
Yep.
And so the future, in this concept of prophecy, the future can be known in advance. And we've talked about this before in other podcast episodes and its relevance to like the Bible or whatever. The characters themselves still, outside of the normal honor code of chivalry or whatever, still live under Christian moral judgment, right? Their choices still matter to God, whatever it is that they're doing. If it's sin, if it's repentance, the sacraments inside the story, the sacrilegiousness of any parts of these stories, the grace that's given to them, the concept, like I said, of providence, they all remain part of the world that both Mallory and Tennyson wrote them in. That makes sense. And the tradition of foreknowledge doesn't necessarily mean the tradition of compulsion, and the way that like Galahad is compelled to find the Grail, essentially. Sorry about that, guys. But knowing that something will happen is different from forcing that person to make it happen. And Sir Thomas Mallory uses these stories to explain that there's a distinction for this inside of theology, that the narrative essentially depends on this concept of prophecy inside of theology. Merlin as well can know where Balin's life is going to go while Balin is still in the process of making these decisions that arrive him there. And again, the sword is the clearest example of this. He's given a warning about it. He's not given enough information. He keeps a story anyway. And it's a pattern throughout this story. It's a pattern throughout all these other ones with Achilles and Sigurd and some of these other things. Their actions, whether they're coming from pride or loyalty or whatever, they're also sometimes come from desperation. And essentially, those choices are important because the prophecy usually tells them where those events are headed without essentially telling them how they should act along the way. Does that make sense? And at the same time, Balin never has complete control over what happens. He doesn't know essentially that he's going to make all of these terrible decisions. And that's where this concept of providence comes in to sort of add this extra layer on top of this. Because providence means that history can have an order or hierarchy and a purpose larger than the intent of the people acting inside of this hierarchy. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everything bad that happens will become good because there's some good supposedly later down the road that's going to come from it. It means that the concept of evil or failure or human error does not necessarily have the final word, right? And the dolorous stroke shows this clearly, right? He causes this wound essentially that lays waste to 3 different kingdoms, but the later Grail story that has this redemption arc that the story of Balin does not. Nothing about the Grail story makes the suffering that the kingdom goes through and the wounded king or the Fisher King goes through, doesn't make it not real. All of the people that died when the castle collapsed and all the people that died of starvation, they are still dead. The kingdoms were still ruined, and Balin is still at fault for all of these things. But it enters a larger history that Balin will not live to see, essentially, that he's essentially breaking, he, trying to think of ways to this, what he breaks will eventually become part of the later Grail quest and the healing, completely unaware of that at the same time. And that's why providence as well is different than this concept of fate. Fate is obviously meaning that the ending is already fixed. You're not going to change it. You will meet your destiny on the road to avoiding it, right? That no matter what you do, it's going to happen. But providence allows for this concept that there's a greater good that will come out of the end of it. This catastrophe or whatever still sits inside of a larger moral history with judgment, right? repentance still can happen, healing can still happen, and this restorative process that happens inside these two stories, the Grail quest and then Balin. That means that restoration of all of this waste is completely and totally possible. And so the Christian structure essentially of these stories is not there to erase the bad that's happened. It places this limit on it, in that, while Balin, what he did is terrible, it's not the final version of what life is going to be. There is still this providential restoration. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was talking about it a little bit last week, but it's this idea of the Felix culpa, or the fortunate fall. And that's why I drew comparisons between Balin and Judas Iscariot in the Bible, because both of them were prophesied to, right? Jesus looked at Judas during the Last Supper and said, what thou must do quickly, for my King James bros. And that's the way I memorized it as a kid, so I can't. That's the first version that comes to my head. But this idea that Jesus knew what Judas was going to do, and he even says, what thou must do, right? Do quickly. And it's because if there is no betrayal of Jesus, then there is no crucifixion. If there's no crucifixion of Jesus, there's no resurrection. If there's no resurrection, there's no forgiveness of sins, right? And so it's a thing that must take place, and Judas fulfilled his purpose in the grand scheme of the passion of the Christ. And that's not to say, obviously, to further your point, that God made Judas do this evil thing, right? That was ultimately going to lead to him taking his own life, and seeing Jesus killed. But that, and this is where the foreknowledge, right, from the God's ultimate foreknowledge from what the theology of what would be called predestination is. You have to be able to separate that God knows all things that are going to happen, but that doesn't mean that God necessarily causes all things to happen. There are examples in Scripture where we see that God causes certain things. These are providential points that God inserts himself into the narrative, like the calling of Saul into Paul, right? Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus, and asks Saul at the time, like, why are you persecuting me? Which ultimately leads Saul to accepting Jesus Christ, and then going on to writing basically most of the New Testament, and being one of the apostles and one of the founders of the first century church. That's a providential point that God inserted himself into the narrative. But God doesn't cause all things to happen. He just knows all things that are going to happen. And here in the Tale of Balin, you can really see where the writers at the time are taking these biblical theological ideas, and they're applying it into this story to kind of break it down and make it more digestible, right, for the culture at the time.
Yeah, you can't separate those things. Yeah. And I think that concept is it's completely a representation too of chivalry. We have this like sort of joking way of talking about chivalry in modernity. Chivalry is dead because men don't hold the door open anymore or whatever. You know what I mean? But like, that is such a flawed understanding of what chivalry is supposed to mean. Chivalry, the point of chivalry is restraint and limitation. It's not this hold the door open for me or buy me flowers sort of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And to prove that, honestly, like chivalry, this concept, and it is a code. It's not just a word to describe something. But it developed around men specifically, whose role in society literally revolved around violence.
Yes.
Right? Medieval knights did not become knights or warriors because somebody invented the code of chivalry. They were already part of military aristocracy that existed and was shaped because of war and feuds, right? Which all had to do with, family loyalty, land and resources, and then of course personal reputation, which is, part of the themes of all of this. But chivalry developed partly as well as an attempt to place limitations around this reality of violence, right? A knight had to be capable of violence because it was his job to be capable of violence. If you were useless and you could not defend yourself, or you could not defend your lord or your household or whatever, you would not fit inside of this culture. Medieval culture admired your masculine prowess for these reasons, which is a lot more than just this concept of raw strength we've been talking about. This is a very important distinction in this story. It's proven ability inside of combat. And the problem was that masculine prowess essentially cannot tell you whether or not all of this strength you have and the exertion of that strength or the execution of violence was justified, right? And that's where these limitations and this code come from. You can be very brave and fight for the wrong reason. Everybody says that. You know what I mean? What one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. How many times have you heard that, especially if you're a GWAD veteran? But you could be loyal to somebody who did not deserve your loyalty, and you can respond to an insult in a way that makes everything worse. It can create a feud. Think of, in the United States, the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? Oh, yeah. You could defend your honor as well while damaging the authority of your lord that you are made to serve, that you claim to serve and required to serve. This is very familiar with this concept as a military brat, where if I got in trouble on base, my dad got in trouble on base, right? And I think that's why chivalry placed inside war, the warrior culture is a very, very large structure. Your strength is supposed to answer to authority and law, and then Christian religious obligation, okay, because the chivalric code is rooted in Christianity. The hospitality that's meant to come with this, we talked about King Arthur's court, King Pelham's court. Hospitality is more than just offering somebody a glass of water. It comes with this acceptance of obligation. If you are the king or the baron or the lord of that court, you've made a sworn agreement to uphold that hospitality, and the duties that you have for the people that are now, under your tutelage. Basically, the point was not to make people harmless and just opening the door for somebody. It's to make you using violence to serve a larger order than yourself, which is this concept that still exists today inside the military. And the story of Balin fits inside that problem really well, because he possesses all of these qualities that a knight is supposed to have. He doesn't like treachery. He's willing to put himself in danger for other people and does it over and over and over and over again. The distinction for that is essentially central to the concept of chivalry. He has the ability to defeat other armies, but it doesn't necessarily give him the authority to decide when he's going to go do those things, if that makes sense. The concept of honor makes this even harder. Your reputation will have practical consequences on your life and practical consequences on the lives of the people around you. Like I said at the top of this, other people had to be able to trust that you were going to be, brave and capable at the same time. And if you were publicly humiliated by not doing anything, then that would completely damage your standing forever. It wasn't something you could go to the next town and necessarily recover from. Like, you would have to completely leave your country, and at that point, you are now an outcast, and you're gone from that culture. But inside that culture, retaliation, can feel necessary because an insult threatens something larger than your private feelings, your lord or the kingdom that you're there to protect, or you're wearing as a sigil on your uniform or your shield, but that will show up in weakness in people who don't have the faculties to govern themselves, right? If every single time you are insulted, it requires that you respond in a violent way, then the person who's insulting you is controlling your behavior. You're not governing your own thoughts. So all somebody has to do is essentially provoke you, and you will cut back across your honor as a person.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It provided structure for that warrior culture of the day to exist inside, right? Like that would be the best way that I could describe it. And in our modern kind of Americanized Western culture, it's very hard for people to conceptualize because we take our individualism, rugged American individualism, and we esteem it very highly, right? So this idea, and you're seeing this right now kind of play out in the same Lindsay phenomenon.
Yeah.
That's good. I don't know, all those videos that these moms
Psychopaths
are making, right, about this. You can see in there that their idea of my actions directly affect somebody else, they don't have like that mentality is not there, right? And so because of that, they're making these videos completely, it's like, I don't want to be around my kids and they're such a drain and all of this, and everything is me, how it affects me, without even stopping to consider that your actions, your attitude, the way that you conduct yourself affects those around you. No human being is truly an island unto themselves. It's like the most relevant modern example that I can bring to that. But, again, back then, though, you had this chivalry code that provided the structure for all of this to exist inside, and then also reminded you, like you were saying, that your actions, they affect your lord above you, and then you are also responsible to those below you. If a knight ran off all brash and did something incredibly stupid and got himself killed, then now who stands in defense of all of the peasantry, right, inside of their realm that they were sworn to protect? Right now people are going defenseless because of that. So I do think it's very hard for Americans kind of specifically to wrap our heads around this, for sure.
Yeah. And that trust I was talking about before in court, you know what I mean? When people were there, the hospitality culture, that trust coming from a lord, right, in a feudal system is extended to a knight, because like you said, like, above you and then below you, but around you, that trust. I mean, and again, right, there are abuses of power. I just want to make that very clear. Like, I'm well aware this system didn't work perfectly, but we're talking about like the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
That trust, you were by proxy an extension of that hospitality when you went out and you executed the orders of the lord that you were supposed to, or you were a representation of him while you were out and about, sort of the way that like the military tells you if you're in a foreign country, you are, and there's literally signs as you drive out the gate, right? You are now an ambassador to the United States. Exactly. So you are an ambassador to the court of hospitality of whomever it was you were riding out for. And there's a trust that gets extended to you that you will be a representation of that. And that too, right, is something that's supposed to factor into your judgment, because just like anything else in modern society today, something bad happens, and then automatically it's Trump's America or it's Biden's America or whatever, when not necessarily those things are coupled with one another, or not necessarily there's a direct line to them, but you are, everything that happens is a representation of the man in charge, or as Truman would say, like the sign on his desk, the buck stops here, as it were. So it's something to take into consideration if you are a knight of the court, you know what I mean?
And it was that same code that you were relying on to protect you, because the enemy was an unspoken agreement across the aisle, that we are both men of honor and we are going to uphold this. And so, in so much as I agree that I'm going to uphold it from my end, and we will do battle in accordance with the code of chivalry, when it comes time that I'm on the receiving end, right, the expectation is that code is there to also protect me. And not just govern my offensive actions.
Yeah. Even, oh, dang. When, oh gosh, his name is just jumped right out of my brain. The king of Troy, he comes to Achilles about, the body of Hector. No, not Agamemnon. he comes to Achilles about the body of Hector, and he invokes, an honor code essentially about him to get him to let him, give him the proper burial rights. And when you were talking about
Priam.
yeah, King Priam, thank you. You were talking about how it protects you from one warrior to, an enemy essentially. Well, it also protects you as well if you get to exist inside of that culture. When one of your knights that you work with all the time is not following that code or cutting across it, it makes you look bad by proxy as well. So the more that you show that you exist inside of it, and the more justice you do it, then the more it shields you and protects you as the person that is actually this idea and this concept, and not just an imperfect person. And when other people that are supposed to be living inside of it aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, it degrades it for everybody.
Yes.
So you're protecting it as well by following it, not just for yourself, but your fellow knights inside of this code of chivalry.
Yeah, because the obvious logical next step, if you're fighting an enemy that refuses to follow the code, is, well, then why should I?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then you become like the animals, right?
Right. Yeah, that's this like slippery slope of apathy that shows up so often now. You know what I mean? Why should I care, basically? But the other concept too inside of this is the concept of prudence. But in classical literature as well, and in Christianity, prudence means practical wisdom. Wisdom that you can put into action. And Aristotle talks about this too, is essentially the ability to judge well things that actually, what you should actually do in a particular situation. And the Thomas Aquinas as well develops on top of that idea and essentially describes prudence as a virtue that directs the other virtues. So the virtues of courage and justice and loyalty, they don't exist and they're not enough on their own. Prudence determines how those virtues should be used in the here and now under specific circumstances, and then not just underneath those circumstances, but then to what end are your actions heading towards. And obviously, again, this matters a lot here in the story with Balin. And I'm going to use some examples again, which you guys have heard, but under the concept of prudence, just to kind of show this in action. Again, practical wisdom that can be applied in a tangible way. The Lady of the Lake appears in King Arthur's hall. Balin sees her as an enemy because of these terrible things she did to his family. But what he fails to hold alongside of that, these grievances he's got with her, is essentially the authority over the top of him. He puts himself above this code. And she comes in, he does the wrong thing. The same happens with Garlon. He sees a murderer, right? A murderer deserves justice. Garlon has killed people who were traveling right beside Balin in this story, but he also is sitting at another man's table who just so happens to be Garland's brother, if you recall. And the act of killing Garland obviously does more than just punish him. It creates an entirely new obligation for King Pelham, who has to respond to his actions, because Balin is still beholden to this concept of authority over the top of him. And then again, getting into the spear chamber and the where the body of Joseph of Arimathea is present, it shows just how much he's ignorant to this concept, because Pelham, like I said earlier, is chasing after him in his own castle, trying to execute justice, which honor code binds him to do, and killing him is the correct execution of that justice. He cannot find a weapon to defend himself. It's a complete and total representation of the situation he's in. He cannot know as well then too that the spear that he picks up has a sacred history that's tied to Christ, and then is also tied to the Grail lore, and that by stabbing King Pelham, that he is destroying all of these kingdoms around King Pelham's castle. And then again, obviously with the island and his brother, and then as well, he kills his brother in this act. It's essentially his narrow judgment the entire time without realizing that he is not the person who's supposed to be carrying out. He is not justice incarnate walking around. An enemy can still be an enemy. A murderer can still be guilty of murder. It doesn't mean that you're the authority that is meant to bring down that judgment on top of these people. And even his extraordinary abilities as a warrior, you know, and going out and fighting these enemies to get back in Arthur's favor, it's still done at the behest of Arthur. So all of these things he's doing, you know, whether he believes that this is me and sort of lets this go to his head and, you know, I'm doing these things as an act for me to get back in your good favor, whether he realizes it or not. And again, your ignorance is not self-defense. You are existing underneath a broader authority and honor culture, regardless of your, you know, belief in it or regardless of your knowledge of it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And all of my GWAT bros, right? Like it became a point of contention or argument with like the rules of engagement and how far was too far, and all of these arguments that started going back and forth about us being, you know, told to fight with two arms tied behind our back. And certainly there's a place for that argument and allowing warriors to conduct themselves as need be in a war, right? But anybody that had that experience knows about all the tropes that we were told, right? Well, you still have to carry a code. You have to be above it. Just because they commit war crimes, we're the United States. We don't fight like that, right? There's a certain amount of code that we carry ourselves with, and I think that's like the best modern example of what you were talking about. And I did see a lot of guys that gave in to temptation of I'll just say like lowering their standards, right, in that realm. I'll say it as gently as possible. But it really reminds me of a scene in the Pacific, if you saw that miniseries, which was the follow-up to Band of Brothers, where Eugene Sledge, fantastic book, by the way, with the Old Breed at Peleliu, is one of the books that series is built on, and then the other one was Helmet for My Pillow, if anybody cares. That's where the bulk of the scripts came from. But there's a scene in there where Eugene decides that he's going to take, you know, his K-bar out and he's going to get some gold from the teeth of a dead Japanese soldier, and his platoon mate stops him from doing that. You really shouldn't do that. Why not? You guys all do it, right? Is the argument. And he goes, well, and again, going back to what we were just talking about, once you've violated the code, you really don't have a leg to stand on, a moral leg to stand on at all, to tell somebody else that they shouldn't do something. But you can tell in that scene that his buddy is trying to keep him from committing a moral injury on himself. Eugene was kind of the last in that group that had held himself to a higher standard. And you could see that meant something to the guys around them, because when he was getting ready to climb down into that same pit that everybody else was in, it bothered the others. So they were like, hey, you don't want to do that. Well, Doc says that they have germs. So, germs. And that ends up becoming the excuse that Eugene needs not to cross that line. But I thought it was so brilliantly acted, because it plays out exactly what you were just talking about. And I do want to give the chat an opportunity to get in here a second. And I see that you're chatting with them, but it's Hubs asked.
I was literally going to say, hey.
Oh, okay. If you want to jump on that one, go for it.
I was just say I answered it in the chat, but I was going to pose the question to you as well.
Oh, okay.
And I'll just read it for those of us on Rumble. But it's Hubs. He says, why do you think so many people have a lack of responsibility today? Has honor and reputation become an idea of the past? And I answered him, and his response was, perhaps it does take an individual responsibility. Only we can set the example and demand the same respect in return. all of this boils down to individual responsibility.
Yes.
You have to be accountable to yourself, and only when you start to master yourself can you really start to be an example to anybody else. There's one thing to say those things out loud. Eventually you'll get caught by your actions. I think everything boils down to taking that personal responsibility, and then as you learn, you have a duty to transfer that information or that wisdom that to other men at the same time. I think that is a duty that you should have, and understand that your father should teach you, that you should come to this understanding, essentially be prudent enough to pass along that information. But anyway, that's what I would say to follow up to my answer before. But Chris, I'm sure you have some thoughts too.
I do think not everywhere. There are certain pockets where honor and responsibility and duty still matter, and they're cultivated and taught. But I do think that largely honor and responsibility have become antiquated notions, and that's why largely on one side of the political aisle, everybody calls it victim mentality or whatever. If you want to, but I'm going to use that terminology to go forward. Why victim mentality is pushed so hard, because if you can get somebody to believe that they are forever a victim, you've stripped them of their agency, and now personal responsibility and honor and notions like that they can't even exist inside of that paradigm, because you can't be held responsible for anything that happens to you if you're a victim. Correct. And those things are stripped from you. And I think that even if people aren't able, the average kind of left-wing acolyte can't articulate it, the big thinkers that came up with the Marx and some of these other guys that came up with these ideologies, they knew exactly what they were doing. Like they knew exactly what they were doing, and it's in their writings. So
yeah, Lenin talks about deceiving people inside of what is to be done. It's a core tenet of that. It's on purpose. It's the part of the role of the vanguard as well. So deception is sort of one of the points, I guess. And then two, right, Antonio Gramsci's Long March to the Institutions: lie about who you really are until you're in power, and then become the person you are, because now you have the power. And this actually ties right back into this concept of formation that we're talking about, is that you're going in under these false pretenses. You're not taking the time to develop yourself as somebody worthwhile. And then now you have the reins of this entire machine that was built on these concepts that you lied about just to subvert. It's a complete and total bastardization. It's an act of sacrilege in and of itself, which just shows you the fucking character that these cowards have. Absolutely. This is why, I take issue with anybody, telling, oh, well, they should just lie about who they are to get into politics and then be somebody else. It's just like, you're no bad than, a Leninist or a Maoist or a Trotskyite or any of these guys, Gramsci or Marcuse or any of these guys, that you really should take the time to read and learn about, because these are the dudes that built the hallways that, from which these democratic socialist asswipes are walking down right now. That's exactly who they are. You want to understand, know your enemy. And essentially I view somebody like Hassan Piker as an enemy, or some of these other people. They have no interest in preserving the United States. They want to completely and totally eradicate it. The Democratic Socialist Party has a stated goal on their website, and they've said it publicly in the news, that they want to destroy the Constitution and rewrite it, and then they want to get rid of the Senate and then place the judiciary and the executive up underneath one branch of government, which is exactly how you wind up having laws passed by one person legally. Remember the entire argument I gave about Articles 148 and 176 inside of the Weimar Constitution, that gradually this consolidation of power came down to, the fact that it was completely constitutional,
Yep.
and all that consolidation into completely and totally unilateral decision making never stepped outside of the bounds of that, you know. And if you're a democratic socialist and you get what you want, well, then everything you're doing is constitutional, because you've now rewritten the Constitution, which is what all these people are doing anyway, by trying to recreate an entire moral and ethical and honor anchor that we already have, and then saying that this is good and acting based on it. You know, it's the goal is a subversion of culture, it's a subversion of civics, it's a subversion of you as an individual. You know, it's just all of these things. It, to me, it's just pervasive by nature, and if it's pervasive by nature, then there's no option but to burn it. You know, that's just why I say know
Right.
your enemy. There's no greater skill you can, you know, well, I don't know if I should, this maybe sounds a little hyperbolic, but that's a skill you should absolutely have, is to know your enemy.
I think a lot of people get wrapped around the axle of defending the Constitution from
Mm.
and I'm having a hard time articulating the word, from the the way that it's enacted, as
You
in,
said it one more time. It got like a little foggy for me for a second.
sorry, so many people
No,
get
you're fine.
wrapped around the axle of defending the Constitution from a procedural standpoint,
Mm,
and fail to remember that we need to defend the ideals that the Constitution is built on and stands for. Because just like your example, you know, Weimar Germany, everything they did was constitutional. There are procedural routes that can absolutely dismantle the Constitution inside of it. And, you know, our founders actually built that into it. It's a living, breathing document. But if you're not defending the ideals that the Constitution actually stands for, if the Constitution is no longer protecting or providing for its citizenry, you're not defending those ideals, then the
mhm,
procedure of the Constitution is just Robert's Rules of Order, essentially, in government,
mm,
right?
yeah.
Like you've missed the forest for the trees on that
Mhm,
point. And
yeah. Well, Hobbes has another good question. He says, "Do you think the lack of strong moral male role models in our society today, it could be argued our father's generation is what caused our current predicament?" And I said that I absolutely think it's part of the issue. And then I said, as well, the prevalence of feminism, which to me is really just an offshoot of postmodernism. What do you think?
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I wouldn't say that it singularly caused it, but I definitely think
Mm-mm.
it was another large domino
Oh yeah.
in that line, 100%. And
There's
that's
a lesson about, as a society becomes more egalitarian, you know, it doesn't mean everybody is equal. And then two, was it who is it says that a size society, as a society becomes more corrupt, it gets more laws or something like that. I'm totally fucking that quote up, you know. But that's another thing that you see a lot of, is like, you know, laws exist to you know, protect people, but also put boundaries on people who have every intent on breaking those laws, you know.
sure.
And as time has gone on, you know, you see the consolidation of a lot of those things and the development of some of these infrastructures that weren't there before too. But anyway.
No, and a lot of people, you know, like to point out the whole fourth turning, you know, or the cycle of hard times make hard men make easy times make weak men, right? But they fail to realize that, and they try to take solace in that. You know, you see all the memes, and it's like, you are here where hard
Yep.
times are getting ready to make hard men again. But one thing that's completely left out of that reasoning is hard men doesn't equal good men necessarily,
Yeah.
right? So
And your
somebody's gonna,
strength is not justice.
yeah, exactly. Somebody's gonna be in charge, sure. You know, hard men will eventually stand up, but that doesn't mean that they're good men.
Yeah,
So,
justice requires strength,
right.
right? But and that's the whole lesson here with Balin, is that your strength is not justice. It also is not greater. Your individual strength is not greater than the honor code and authority that you sit underneath of, whether it's, you know, in a feudal system, it's a lord or a baron or a king, or it's underneath Christianity and Christ, you know, these things that you're supposed to beholden to. And it's this hubris inside of this, and mistaking your capability for justice and being the person who can. You're forgetting everything that you're tied to when you do these things. And I think actually this is my last point, really, is to kind of summarize some of this stuff. But I think that that is like a great segue to sort of round this entire conversation out.
Yeah.
You know, because I think Balin's central problem is that he has what I would call an unintegrated strength, right? He obviously is courageous and has all of these things. He has a conscience, like I said, when he mourns the death of Columba. Obviously, he has regret about Balan and all of these other things. But the problem is that they don't work together to form good judgment for him. And he sort of loses the ability to do that over and over again, or he shows that he doesn't have that ability over and over again. That his moral understanding of these concepts, it often becomes only clear after he's already made a mistake, right? The remorse is evidence of that. But it's, if your actions can seriously affect other people, then your judgment has to come before you make those mistakes, which is what he lacks. And is the point of all of this. You need to become the man you're supposed to be far before whatever tragedy or catastrophe is going to meet you down the road, so that you become the person that is worthy and ready to meet it. I gave the example again of Edmond Dantes in The Count of Monte Cristo. If he somehow would have learned of the treasure prior to his unjustified imprisonment and betrayal by his friend, right? He would not have been able to use the treasure in the way that he did. But even further, the point of the story is the way he exercises his justice. And it's a much bigger story than just revenge, right? They are not always just acts, and that's a point. It's a concept, and there's guilt that Edmund grapples with throughout this story of the things that he's doing. And so how you cannot be unchanged by your actions even when you recognize them, which is why there's this concept that responsibility and self-control comes into play. And you cannot depend on other people being there to stop you every time, which is what sort of the monk represents inside the prison with him. It's this, it's God on the other side of the wall basically telling you that you shouldn't do this. You have to become your own man, formed yourself in that. You're recognizing your own limitations and your how to self-govern yourself. And like I said, not to just keep repeating myself, but to be the person to meet the catastrophe when it comes and not have to form yourself inside of it.
Abbe Faria was his name, by the way.
Faria, thank you.
But what is it that you said earlier? You said something really profound. Did you say you can be worthy of something? No, you said you can be something, but not be worthy of it. You can be... Trying to remember exactly how
I'm trying to remember what I said.
Yeah, exactly how I phrased it. This is probably about an hour ago now. But basically, like you can be, and I'm trying to remember the exact word, the verb that you used.
I think I remember what you were saying is like I was talking about authority, and I was saying that like you can technically meet the qualifications for that authority, but it doesn't mean you're worthy of the position.
Right. And that got me thinking about
I was thinking about like officers in that example.
Right. But I think that's really profound. Like you can be granted something, you can be given something, you can be bestowed something, and not be worthy of it. And I think that's exactly where we're at in our country right now. I'm reminded.
Successive monarchy is a great example of that.
Yeah, exactly. You can be bestowed something and not be worthy of it. And remember Ben Franklin's words, it's like, what did you give us, Mr. Franklin? A democracy or a republic? A republic, madam, if you can keep it. And so that's exactly where we're at right now, is we've been bestowed this Western culture. We've been bestowed this country, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants. And largely, I think, on the whole, we are showing that we are unworthy of it, unworthy of keeping it. And we need to... Like boots need to be put in some asses, and like we've got a lot of building to do to be worthy of this gift that this generation has been given. Right? It's our time, it's our turn, and either we're going to pass it on to the next, or it's going to burn. You know?
That's exactly why Balin was why I wanted to start with this like
Yeah.
tradition of the West and King Arthur, because it is rife with literally every concept we first off have ever talked about and will continue to talk about. They exist inside of this intense structure of the code of chivalry, you know, and these Arthurian stories through generations have given people a way to think about power and duty, and then the Christian faith and the laws and the loyalty that you're supposed to have, and then of course human weakness, which is what you're talking about. You know, the knights, these guys that exist inside this violent honor culture, they're not important or relevant because they are perfect representations of that. They're relevant because they are imperfect human beings, and the lessons come in not necessarily in their successes, but in the fact that their virtues are tested over and over and over again in situations where the right choice is difficult. And this concept sounds so simple. We all learned about it as a kid, you know, but it's just, he's one of the most clearest examples of that. And he just, to me, is a representation of the Western man today, who, you know, this like fake gym culture of like just gonna go get strong, and like that's what it means to be a man, or like, you know, I'm just gonna, you know, crush as much ass as I can, and that's what it means to be a man, without taking the time to actually learn about like who you are as a person and honing the person you're supposed to be. Like I said, man, you should be formed before you meet catastrophe along the road. Otherwise, whatever formation comes out of that catastrophe because you weren't ready to meet it is not necessarily going to be a good thing. That's when people fall into this like victim mentality, that this thing happened to me and is therefore the definition of me, rather than being above it to begin with and then knowing how to continue being above it while it's happening. You know, people can come out of that and rise above those things, you know, as time goes on, but that's not the culture today. The culture today is you are a victim, and therefore that victimhood is what gives you moral and ethical good, and also abdicates that responsibility from you, which is a total perversion of all of this, and it's a sickness inside of our society.
Yeah.
And I just think that Balin is like the most important lesson inside of this, like why he's so important. It just shows like your great ability before being fully developed does not provide you the judgment you need to use it well under pressure.
Yeah, 100%. You are either in a fight or you're preparing for a fight.
Yeah,
Those are the two phases, right?
correct.
Yeah.
Well, guys, Chris, I don't want to like take your thunder, man. If you got anything else,
Oh,
um,
got an ad to
uh,
read before we get out of here, but that's
okay,
it.
one sec. Hub says, I do think that the feminism movement plays a role in where we are today, mixing how women think and govern with men for the first time society years down the line. And this is the society we have. I'm not sexist. I don't think you're being sexist, man. I think that there's a perversion of like a natural hierarchy that's going on. And I
Oh
don't
yeah.
mean like power over somebody. I just mean like the natural order of things. We both are, this too, like this like concept that like men and women have no definition, you know, as, but at the same time, like equal pay for the WNBA. You know what I mean? Like these things are just, they're always so antithetical with one another, which is why they have a hard time keeping up with themselves, and they face rake themselves all the fucking time, you know? It's just, but it's because they don't have real moral and ethical anchors. They're trying to pretend that this virtue signaling is the same thing as having an honor code.
Right.
There's no honor amongst thieves, right? You know, that's what it is. You guys have absolutely fucking nothing to hold yourselves to, and you're not going to hold yourselves accountable. And how could you in the first place? You can't even define what good is.
Exactly. You're 100% correct. That's why I start every single debate. If somebody wants to have a debate with me, I'm like, dude, I'm willing to do that. But we're going to start here though. Can a thing be true or untrue? We literally have to start there before we can move forward on anything.
It's like when you and I were
Because of
talking about like semantic overload.
right.
Like how can, if we can't even agree on like the epistemology of our culture, how can we even have a conversation?
Exactly.
If apple means orange to you and apple means apple to me,
Right.
we literally can't have a talk. So, all right, do this. We're going to kick this ad out real fast for Rumble, and we're going to get out of here. But I truly, truly appreciate you guys listening. Part 3 is next week. We're going to get into some mystical stuff and talk about some of this cool Indiana Jones shit that like the Nazis were actually doing, looking for the Spear of Destiny. It's going to be pretty cool.
Absolutely. Anyway. Hold up here. There you go, guys. Check this out. We hear a lot about crypto, but here's the part most people miss. Crypto was created so you could actually own and control your money. After the 2008 financial crisis, Bitcoin was designed as an alternative to banks. So instead of a bank holding your money, delaying transfers, or limiting access, You're in control. And if you've ever had to wait for a transfer to clear, then you felt that problem. Now, fast forward to today. Everyone's heard of crypto, but getting started still feels complicated. And that's exactly why I use Rumble Wallet. It takes all that complexity and makes it simple. Choose what you want: Bitcoin, dollar-backed stablecoins, or even digital gold backed by real gold. No complicated setup. It connects with MoonPay, so you can use your credit card, debit card, or bank and be up and running in minutes. Once you're set up, you can even support your favorite Rumble creators like us directly. So do this now. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description and download Rumble Wallet. From there, you can set up your wallet, tap buy, and you're in the game. In just a few minutes, you can go from hearing about crypto to actually owning some. Thank you to Rumble for supporting the channel, and thank you to you guys. Go check that out if that's something you're interested in.
Oh yeah. Well, like I said, man, next week's episode is going to be a good time, I think, because we're going to get into some of the fun stuff around some of these artifacts and like if they actually exist. And, you know, like I said, obviously, Indiana Jones did a really, really good job talking about how the Nazis were actually going after some of this stuff. They really were. And Chris and I actually talked at length about that in the Huska Castle episode. If you guys have never watched that one, I know a lot of that stuff is going to come up again. But, you know, the SS, the Thule Society and the Vril Society, and then obviously all the ties in with like Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, and some of these beliefs around Arianism, all sort of tie into the search for these artifacts, not just tied to Christianity. You know, these guys went to places like Tibet and all over the world looking for some of this stuff. So it's going to be a pretty fun conversation, not as laden with philosophical concept as it is more like history, and then some of this fun stuff with you know, some of the lesser characters in history, or the least savory people in history, I guess I could say. But anyway, love you guys. Hopefully see you guys all back for Friday night. It's a live fire, same time, 7 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And dude, yeah, we'll let Chris take us out like he does.
Hell yeah. Love you guys. See you on Friday. Keep it real. Go with God.
Your dick.
Don't be a dick.
I thought you weren't going to say it. I was like, I'm going to say it then.
I always say it, dude.
There you go. Appreciate you guys over there on YouTube.